thanks for coming. Again, sustainability. Look at all you people. It's crazy. All right, so what are we not going to talk about? We're not going to talk about global warming. The Earth, the last ice age ended 20,000 years ago. The Earth has been warming ever since. We don't care. We're not going to talk about whether the Earth is warming because of the greenhouse gas effect. Again, we don't care. We're not going to talk about whether that greenhouse gas is emitted naturally or man-made. We don't care. All right, we're not going to talk about climate change or whether any of the extreme weather we've been having is a result of global warming. We don't care. And you're saying, oh my God, where are we going here? What's this all about? What do we care about? We work for companies who have made some commitments and then dumped them in our laps to meet. Whether you agree with them or not, whether you agree with the wording, you probably didn't have a seat at the table. They're lying in your lap right now, and you need to satisfy them. That's what matters to us. That's what we're here to talk about today. So all the rest of it's noise. We're not going to talk about that. Let's talk about why. I mean, for instance, for those of you who are familiar with the SBT, the science-based targets, maybe you don't agree that they're very scientific, whatever. Again, we don't care. We're going to go on by that. But all this pressure placed upon our companies to come up with these goals by our external providers and the press is where we're at today. So for instance, when you put out something out there that the U.S. data centers consume more energy than the country of Mexico, that gets people's attention. It gets the attention of our clients, the government, our investors, et cetera. And then our companies need to react to that, mostly because our competitors reacted to it, or people out there. So you've got people out there coming out with announcements, talking about their renewable energy, their energy efficiency, design and construction, so much going on out there. And then coming up with plans to meet those goals and everything. Kind of forced our companies into coming up with these statements that may have not been well formed back many years ago. And now they're in your lap, and it's up to you to solve that problem. You've got to address that. Whether you agree with everything or not, just set it aside. It's noise. Put on your blinders. We've got to figure out some way to get there. Adding to the chaos, now people are starting to call it all out. Can we actually get there? Does this make sense? Do any of our roadmaps actually, are they achievable? Can we even get there? Here's one recent survey. Over half of the decision makers question their firm's sustainability strategy. Good Lord. I mean, those are 1,000 senior officials that they interviewed out there and said, yeah, I don't know that I agree with what we're doing or where we're going. Again, it doesn't matter to us. It's in our lap. We've got to solve for this. Now, it used to be way back when I say way back when, a year or two ago, all you had to do was come up with a good story. Produce 100 or 150-page glossy pamphlet with lots of words and pretty pictures. And when somebody asked the question, you handed them that artifact, and that satisfied them, and it went away. It's not that way anymore, folks. We're doing RFPs now where there's specific reporting. We have to come up with a roadmap. And then we have to provide data, either monthly, quarterly, to show that we're making progress on that roadmap, why or why we're not, what we're going to do in the future or plan to do in the future to achieve that roadmap. So it's starting to get real. And the bottom line here is, what is our lighthouse? What's the number one goal? The number one goal here is simply put, is to reduce and eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions associated with our business operations. I'll say that again. Reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions associated with our business operations. The word that's being used out there a lot for this now is emissionality. It's not a word, but that's what's being used to describe that string or that lighthouse or where we're headed. So since we seem to be focused on greenhouse gases, and that's what we should be focused on, let's talk about them a little bit. Let's talk about the global warming potential. We're all familiar with CO2, and CO2 is kind of the norm. That's kind of the baseline. Everything is normalized back to CO2. Methane is a greenhouse gas. It's carbon. We talk about emitting carbon in the atmosphere, CH4. There's carbon in that. That has 32 times the global warming potential of CO2. So when we look at CO2, we say, well, that's bad, but methane seems to be a lot worse. Let's look at our refrigerants, our hydrofluorocarbons, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, 1,000 times the global warming potential of CO2. Pretty substantial. See, maybe we ought to be looking a little bit more at that. But anyways, I'll come to that in just a second. All right. So what do we need to do? We in the data center industry, these are our scopes. And if you're not familiar with scopes, there they are right now. Our Scope 1 emissions come from our generators and our refrigerants. Scope 2 come from our utilities. We are energy consumers. We buy our energy from somebody. That somebody is doing something to emit global greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then Scope 3 is embodied. That's a little bit crazier, so just real brief. When somebody builds a chiller, somebody has to mine the materials for that chiller. When you mine those materials, you're emitting carbon into the atmosphere. When you transport that material to the manufacturing plant, you manufacture it, your employers or the manufacturing folks go back and forth to the plant, they finish it, they package it, they deliver it to you. All of those things emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they need to be accounted for. But they're not recurring, they're one time. It's embodied in that piece of equipment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what are we here to talk about? That's kind of a long foundation, kind of building the base for what we're really here for, the pragmatism. The two things you need to do with these requirements, these commitments that you're now responsible for satisfying, sitting in your lap, are to know your carbon and mitigate your carbon. So that's being called carbon accounting. Well, how do you account for your carbon? What are the rules? What applies? What doesn't apply? What's in, what's out? I mean, if you look in our financial industry, they have the generally accepted accounting principles. That kind of lays out what you can count, what you can't count, what the words you're going to use are, what the definitions are for those words, what the formatting it is. It's pretty clear. What we don't have are generally accepted carbon accounting principles. We need to get there. There's some work on that. There's some things going in that direction, but don't worry about that. Right now, know your carbon and figure out how you're going to mitigate it. All right, so back to our carbon accounting here. In operations, that's recurring. Scope 1 is recurring, so as long as you're operating, you're generating those greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2, all right, your utility, you're an energy consumer, you're generating those greenhouse gases. Infrastructure, one time. It only happens once, and we'll come back to that in a second. So let's focus on our Scope 1. All right, generator operations. How many of you run your generators for more than 10 or 20 hours a year? Probably not many. Most of you probably have a pretty good utility, so you don't have to run your generators very often. Most of us have air permits that don't allow us to test them very often either, so you're not running them very much at all. So again, know your carbon. When you're looking at your full carbon accountability, and you look at how often you're running your generator and how much greenhouse gas you're emitting, again, reduce and eventually eliminate greenhouse gas emissions associated with your business operations. It's a very small amount over there, but it gets a ton of attention. We're talking about hydrogenated vegetable oil. All right, mixing that with your fuel because it reduces your carbon output by about 90%. They say it mixes very well with the #2 red diesel. They say it's more stable in cold temperatures, has better shelf life, doesn't have to be polished as much. Sounds like a really good deal. Again, you're only accounting for this little bit over here. Still, you have to get that HVO to your site, and it's not distributed everywhere very well, so a truck has to deliver that to you. That truck is probably emitting carbon into the atmosphere, that embodied stuff, when it's delivering it to you. It may negate the benefit altogether. I don't know, but it gets an awful lot of attention. Maybe there's other fuels that do the same thing, and it's more expensive. So over time, there'll be better distribution. Maybe it'll get less expensive. I don't know. There's even talk about they're just getting rid of generators because they're so horrible. Again, know your carbon. We're talking about a little tiny piece over here. Get rid of your generators. You use fuel cells, green hydrogen-fired generators. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm in the colo industry, so we have investors who come to or clients who come to us with a checklist, and they go down the checklist and go, let me see your generators. Oh, we got rid of our generators. We use something else. So you don't have generators. We don't make the short list, and that's kind of the way the industry works right now. So for us, it's off the table to even consider anything other than a generator. There is an expectation there will be a generator there. The whole point here being is, again, know your carbon, and we're talking about a little tiny piece way over here, and look at all the attention and press it's getting. This lends back to the old thinking where you just had to have a good story. This makes a good story. They don't want a good story anymore. They want to look at your carbon and how much of it are you mitigating. And you're going to say, well, I got rid of all this over here. And they're like, it didn't move the needle. It wasn't a big help. Still, it's a good story. Now let's look at our refrigerants. Who here is measuring their refrigerant release to the atmosphere? How do you even do that? I mean, most of us, we just go to our HVAC vendor when he leaves and says, Geez, how much did you add? Well, I added 5 pounds. I must have leaked 5 pounds. That's the best we can do today. Not very good. Refrigerants have 1,000 times the global warming potential of CO2. Seems we might want to pay a lot of attention to that. I don't know. Nobody's really looking at it, so I'm not entirely sure. Maybe across all the data centers, we really don't leak very much refrigerant, so it's not a big deal. I don't know. Seems we should figure that out. What if we are? Can we put boxes around our compressors and detect refrigerant leaks early? Kind of hard to put a box around an evaporator or a condenser, but maybe some kind of leak detectors around the coils there to detect for refrigerant leaks so you can do something about it. We're doing nothing right now. If any of you like to do research and want to do something in this industry that's related to sustainability and be a thought leader, start looking at our refrigerants. Let's start getting the data out there and finding out if it's relevant. Maybe all we leak is, maybe every data center leaks 5 pounds of refrigerant a year. Even at 1,000 times CO2, maybe that isn't relevant. Maybe it is. And if it is, maybe we should be doing something about it. I'm not up here with the answers. I don't know the answer to that, so something good to research on. But this is the one that gets all the attention, Scope 2. So that's our utility, the energy we're using from the utility, and accounting for the carbon that's going into the atmosphere when that energy is produced. And there's a pecking order. There's a preference on how you're going to mitigate that. Number one on the list is for all of us to disconnect from the grid, go out there, build your own solar farm, your own wind farm, or your own microgrid, green microgrid, or whatever, but get off the grid. Not really very pragmatic. We're probably not going to do that. So next down is to go to a solar farm builder or a wind farm builder and buy their energy. So you're going to go to them and say, all right, I'm going to buy your energy. I'll go to my utility. They'll sleeve it or wheel it through their system and deliver it to my site. So I'll get 2 bills. I'll get a bill from the energy provider who's making the solar energy. I'll get a bill from my utility for getting it to me. That's fine. But I've got to sign up for a 10, 15, 20-year contract for this energy in large amounts. So 80,000 gigawatt hours for 15 years delivered to me. I'm in the colo industry. My contracts are 3 to 5 years. I don't know that I'm going to need that energy for 15 years. I'd love to think we would, but maybe we wouldn't. And if a major client churns out, I'm now stuck paying for a bunch of energy I don't need. And I can go to my utility and they'll sell it on the market, and the mark-to-market differential might be a profit, might be a minus, but it's risk. And the real risk comes down to, what if I default? What if they default? How do we settle this $80 to $100 million contract now, because it's a 15-year contract? A pretty big deal. I don't want to do that. I'm in the data center industry. I'm an energy consumer. I don't want to make energy. I don't want to deal with this. This is what my utility is for. So there's a lot of press about people going out there getting their own PPAs, and my hat's off to them. That's tough work. We're doing it. It's hard work. Instead, I prefer to go to my utility and say, you go buy that PPA and you funnel it through to me. If I don't need that energy, you've got a lot of customers, you've got a large load base, you can spread it to whoever else you need to do, and I will buy it from you. And those are called green tariff programs. So a lot of your utilities have green tariff programs, but if you work with them, if you find a project and you want them to invest in it and you're willing to sign up for it, they will move that along, enter it into their green tariff program. Nice thing about green tariff, it's right on your electric bill, just like it is today. You're going to pay a little more for it. There'll be a premium for it. You can turn it on. You can turn it off. You pay for what you use and what you don't use. So green tariffs are pretty attractive. Now, if you're in a deregulated market, you can go off on your own and get these PPAs and buy your energy from them and have your local utility deliver it to you. If you're in a regulated market, you really can't do that. There's some ways you can kind of sort of do it, but not very well. You've got to go through your utility to set up this green tariff arrangement for you, and most of them are pretty receptive to it, especially if you're signing up for it right away. They like that an awful lot. All right, so that's it. Come off the grid, go get your own PPA or VPPA or green tariff. And now we come to the dreaded RECs. RECs have a really bad name, and I don't entirely, well, I do know why, but it's a little bit frustrating. For those of you who don't know what a REC is, a renewable energy credit, whenever a solar or wind farm sells energy into the grid, they bundle with that a REC, and it's worth 1 megawatt hour of energy, and you can buy that. So if I were to go buy from my utility, I buy that REC from them, and it now belongs to me, I can take credit for that green energy. Nobody else can. That's mine. Now that's all well and good as long as I can show that that REC isn't being sold 2 or 3 times to somebody else. The real problem is that most of us go up on the web, we look at our utility, and we see up there that 20% of the utility is renewable energy. So I'm like right out of the bag, I'm 20% renewable right away. No, only if you bought that REC or the green tariff, which is really a REC program, if you bought that. Otherwise, you're brown power unless you bought that REC over there. So there's a lot of double counting out there by people saying, well, my utility's 20% green, so I'm green. I don't have to worry about that. Only if you bought the REC, and that's where the REC. Now, why is a REC important? When you buy that REC, that money is supposed to go into a pot of capital that's used to build more renewable energy sources. That's called additionality. A very important feature there. Plus, it's also tied to the actual energy that's being drawn from that pool of energy associated with the grid. So there are good RECs out there, and your good Green E certified RECs might be $5 to $10 a REC or so. You can go out in the national market and buy a really cheap one, $2 to $3 or so. God only knows what they're tied to, and they might be bits and pieces, lots of different things. It'll be very, very hard to track. There's no governance around this. There's no structure. There's no way to tell whether it's good or not. However, the press has gotten into it. So here you got a case of companies that heavily rely on RECs to meet RE targets and fail to communicate transparency, face criticism. So I redacted the company here, but here's a company who said, we're net zero. And the press dug into it and said, oh, you're buying these $2 to $3 RECs. That doesn't really count. There's no accountability there. I mean, you did something, but I don't know that it was good or bad or whatever. So if you're going to use RECs, and most of us in our roadmaps are going to have to use RECs, there's no way around it. Make sure that it's got, you can verify the additionality, that you know that it is not being double counted. If you're buying it from your utility, it's pretty good. All right. So what is it our stakeholders want to see when we talk about this roadmap? Take a look at this, all right? There's a lot of stuff here. So here you're looking at a data center that starts off at about 1,000 gigawatt hours, and then eventually in FY21, FY30, they're up to about 3,500 gigawatt hours, okay? So not only do you have to account for the power you're using today throughout your roadmap, but also your growth. Interesting here, if you look at the data, across the bottom, this is the dirty stuff. This is the stuff that's emitting greenhouse gases. Look for the first few years. It gets bigger, and it pretty much stays the same size, and then it starts to get a little bit smaller. Anybody on the outside is going to say, I thought you were here to reduce or eliminate your greenhouse gas emissions associated with your business operations. Not only aren't you eliminating, for a while here, it looks like they're getting bigger. Well, it's because the company's growing, it's getting bigger. You need to know your carbon and be able to describe and to explain this stuff to the stakeholders. Now, you will notice that by the time we get to 30, the gray is gone, and it's pretty much made up of green, which is PPA, blue, which is green tariff, and then RECs, which are these here. So this is the roadmap they want to see. Not only do they want to see this roadmap, then they want to see recurring data around how you're achieving that. Are you really buying this stuff? Are you really doing this? In today's FY23, they want to see FY24, 25. What is your plan to achieve those goals within there as well? So you really need to be smart about the goals that you're setting. They need to be specific. You need to understand them. Measurable. Most of them are measurable. Attainable. I mean, I'm even looking at, this isn't my roadmap, but I'm looking at this roadmap. You're really going to get that much PPAs by FY30? Maybe. I don't know. Relevant, well, obviously it's relevant and time-bound. You can see that it's time-bound. So there's a lot of information here. This is what our stakeholders are looking to see, and then they're going to hold you accountable for it. I'll give you an example. I have an RFP right now with our company. We have to fly to New York because that company looked at our roadmap, which isn't this one, but said, I don't see how you can achieve that. You need to sit in a room with us and walk us through what your plans are to achieve that roadmap. So this is real, folks. It's no longer about a good story. It's about coming up with the real stuff. All right, so we've covered scope 1. Now we got scope 2. We talked about the things that are available to you. Let's spend a little bit of time on scope 3. All right, so scope 3, as I mentioned, is the embodied carbon in the piece of equipment or the data center or whatever's been delivered to you. All right, so you see here, from our FDA, the nutrition facts you see on the side. iMasons and their Climate Accord are doing a good job of really pushing something like this on all of our equipment. So when you get a chiller, it's going to have something like that on it. It's going to tell you how much embodied carbon was associated with the manufacturer, mining, delivery, et cetera, of that piece of equipment. So when you buy that piece of equipment, you know how much carbon is coming that you need to account for. You might compete your chillers, not just on price now, but based on how much carbon you have to account for with that chiller. Again, coming, not here yet. A lot of companies say they already have this data, but they're not ready to release it. Why? They're very competitive, and there are no standards around how you measure that You could make a standard of how you report it, but how you measure it, and there's going to be a lot of gamesmanship there. All right. Now, what if I bought a used chiller? I mean, that embodied carbon, I mean, I bought that used chiller. There's no additional greenhouse gases being put in the atmosphere for me buying that chiller other than having it delivered to my site. What about a brownfield building? A greenfield building, I need to account for all the carbon associated with the concrete and the steel and everything to build that building. Brownfield building, I'm just reusing what was already there. I'm not emitting any new greenhouse gases, so maybe this changes the industry a little bit. So when we talk about accounting for that carbon, and again, this is a one-time sort of thing, you can do the math on your own later, but essentially 1 rec, or 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy, covers about a half a metric ton of CO2. So let's say you built a data center, and it was delivered to you with 5,460 metric tons of CO2 associated with it right out of the box. Delivery to you, the steel, the walls, the concrete, the chillers, the PDUs, the UPSs, everything. So you've got to account for that. And at a $10 rec, that turns out to about $126,000. I don't know if those numbers are real. Nobody's done this yet. 451 research is saying you can pretty much expect your day one assigned carbon to be equal to about your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for a year. All right, so there's something there. It doesn't stop there. Eventually, you're going to do capital replace some of your infrastructure. You've got to account for that, unless you buy used equipment. And then, of course, you've got batteries, you've got all your consumables, a lot of carbon in your data center, embodied carbon, scope 3, you've got to account for. So what's the purpose here? What's the goal of all this? Well, the goal of all of this is to drive industry to be more green in their production of their equipment. If you're competing them based on their carbon their embodied carbon, they're going to do that. And that's the whole intent here. Everybody's got to get more green. Brownfield, used equipment, possible alternatives to that as well. For most of you, those 2040, 2050, nobody's really talking scope 3 right now. Everything's scope 1 and 2. That's what everybody's looking at. All right. In closing, being pragmatic, carbon accountability or emissionality. Know your carbon emissions and mitigate those emissions, or have a plan to mitigate those. Come up with a roadmap that's verifiable and you can explain to somebody and defend, because you will have to do that. It's no longer about a good story. It's all about measuring verifiable reductions in greenhouse gases, emissionality. Now, we talked previously about generally accepted carbon accounting practices. There are some good standards out there that can inform you. You don't necessarily have to go certify yourself in them, but if you just read them and go through them, they give you an awful lot of information around things that eventually someone's going to pay attention to and probably place a requirement on us to satisfy, specifically on reporting. So again, when we talked about you can pretty much report your carbon anywhere you want, say you're going to, people can argue with you. Once we get standards out there, it's a little bit harder to argue, and it'll just be more of a discussion point. All right. That was an awful lot of information. I'm hoping now we get questions and discussion around this. Some of you have more experience than others out there. I mean, just yell out a question or a comment or anything. Why haven't you talked about this, or what about that? I tried to boil away all the noise and all the ideology and the politics and all the other crap. Just let's look at what it is we're here to do. And it is, again, to reduce and eventually eliminate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our business operations. It's simply that. Questions? Come on. Yes, sir.
How much is this concrete, and how much is this sway with the breeze?
All right, so the question was, how much of this is concrete, which is interesting because concrete has a lot of carbon associated with it. So he doesn't really mean concrete. He means how much of this is fixed and how much of this is still blowing in the wind. This is all blowing in the wind. It's crazy out there. It's the Wild West. You've got people out there talking about, oh, if you're going to buy renewable energy, make sure you time match it to your actual use. Come on, folks, we aren't quite there yet. We're in a room full of people doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and someone walks in and says, hey, we're going to factor a polynomial. Come on, settle down. We're not quite there yet. Not that it isn't important, but it's good stuff. Someone out there, a very good friend of mine, is a real big fan of scope 4. Oh, good Lord, do we really need any more confusion and chaos around sustainability in the data center being talked about scope 4? Come on, stop it. Just focus on, again, reduction and elimination of your greenhouse gases associated with your business operations. Know your carbon and mitigate it. That you stay focused on that, and, just take it right down to the atoms. You stay focused on that, whichever way this thing blows, breathes, swings, or whatever, it's going to settle back to the ground truth, which is just that, so keep your eye on that. Now, you can go chasing your tail on all this other stuff, because some of it's kind of fun, some of it's kind of industry. Not a lot of it, but some of it is. But just focus on that, because that's what your stakeholders want. That's what your clients are looking for, your investors are looking for, your employees, that's what they're looking for. They want to feel good about this. And I don't care what you say. I mean, if we're emitting greenhouse gases or anything else into the environment, it's unlikely it's good. It may not be as bad as some people say, I don't know. But if we can stop it, why not? It's a good thing. It's a feel-good moment. Let's do it. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Well, all right, so the question was, is there a magic number? Well, there almost never is. People will tell you there is, but there really isn't. Is there a magic number which is the size of a data center? It makes sense to really look at reusing the heat output for something else. There's a lot of great white papers on it, a lot of research on it. In Denver, there was a lot of talk about, or actually in some cases, actual practical applications of using the heat to go into grow houses for the marijuana. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. And it's all good stuff, and although it doesn't really account for your PUE, technically it isn't. Reusing that heat is, and it is a measure, it is actually a green grid measurement. It's good stuff. There's no magic size. I would say it's more about heat, how hot it is. The hotter it is, the better. I mean, the more energy is, the better. I mean, if you're running your data center with a cold out temperature of 60 with a delta T taking it up to 80, 80 isn't very useful. It's not very good. But we're seeing some of these big guys out there really starting to crank this stuff, especially with the AI stuff. We're starting to put out some heat. There's some serious heat there. And I would agree with you. There's probably something we can use it. It's been used for absorption chillers to actually use to cool the facility. There's a lot of things that have been done with it, but I don't think there's any magic number. Certainly not on size, but on temperature. As we can get our hot aisles hotter, as we start to increase it, we become more energy efficient. As the IT equipment can tolerate a hotter hot aisle, well, the output with a 20 to 30 degree delta T uplift on the outside, that's hot. That's high energy air coming out the other. You can use that for things, absolutely. So I think it's more about temperature than it is size. Yes, yes.
Is there any information as it relates to cost? So all of these new regulations and all these things that companies are going to have to adhere to, how much is it going to cost the business going forward in the next 1, 5, or 10 years?
What a great question. And actually the Leader Lab tomorrow is focused on that to some degree. What a great question, because now we've got this yin and yang pull here. Businesses are put in place to make a profit and to grow that profit. Well, wait a minute, I got to spend money to do this stuff over here. So how important is ESG really to us? You saw the Wall Street Journal article. There's a Harvard paper out there that basically says, well, even if you have a profitable project, if it's got a high ESG impact, you should probably cancel it. That might be a bit of a stretch. It's a great question because we don't know. Now, some businesses, and I won't say which ones, are starting to do what they call ring fencing. In other words, like, a company is being held for their operating income. This is what your target is for the year. Well, I would have met that if you didn't make me go buy all this renewable energy or all these credits and everything to offset my carbon. So they ring fenced that off over here and said, well, that doesn't count against you over here, so we'll take that off. But that incents a different behavior. So now you start inventing things to put into the ring fence area to reduce your target over here. It's an interesting yin and yang, and it's very new to an awful lot of people, but the bottom line here is this myth that ESG, or not ESG because that's social and governance, but just environmentally, renewable energy will save you money. There's no evidence of that. You can't find it out there. I'm not going to say there aren't a few places where it is a little bit cheaper, but it's just not true. Stop saying that. People out there and say, well, we're 100% renewable energy, where we have higher margins, we're better. It's not true. Stop saying that. It's just not out. People can say anything, and now that we've got verifiable, you actually report this stuff and actually show what you're doing. People are starting to see that drag, and now companies have to make the decision is, how serious are we about these commitments? Because it's really starting to drag down my performance and my stock price. Oh, good Lord, if you're public, oh, God, that's just horrible. So it's a great point. It's a very hot topic right now, and it's, again, stay to the middle, always stay to the middle. Reduce and eliminate your greenhouse gas associated with your, so just keep focused on that. Whether it's affordable or not, somebody else will make the decision. You, in your jobs as data center managers, you need to just understand, that's what I need to do. I came up with it. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we can get there. Well, we can't afford to do that. Different problem. But that's what we've got to do to get there. So somebody's going to put their big point pants on and make a decision on which way it is we're going to go. Yes, sir.
Some of the big corporates actually they buy excessive amount of flag from one location to compensate for the other location. Higher global corporate goal, getting close to the carbon neutral, right? So what do you think of that? And there should be regulation like that doesn't mean that's not contributing to the global economy or global
Yeah.
right number, right?
So it's a great point, and while I'm not a fan of regulation, in a competitive environment, if you want everybody to do good things that are maybe contrary to profit orientation, you have to regulate it. So we're all playing under the same rules. Do not expect someone to suffer, allow their stock price to suffer because they're being more green. Everybody says, well, I'll take that market share. I'll take it right now. I'll take it all day long. I mean, the short-term thinking, I'm only going to be here for the next year. My number is going to look great. My legacy is going to look great. Doesn't work. It's regulation, which levels the playing field, and now we're all subjected to the same thing. It's probably more have to happen. Again, I'm not a fan of regulation, but regulation does achieve that, and that addresses your point. Yes, sir. When you say, is there some way to say that again? Because are you talking about the utility? Oh, yeah, so that's the time matching thing. You're absolutely right. I think it's early to be talking about that, but I like to just go what's probably, well, they say 20, maybe 30 years from now, when the utility is all green. That's all there is to it. Now, I didn't bring it up earlier, and I'll bring it up now. So let me just go back to that chart for a second here. But you're talking about the time matching, but let me just show you something else over here, because this is an interesting point. Down here, I put in here renewable grid mixed power. Remember I told you, well, unless you bought the REC, in which case you'd account for it over here, you can't account for that. So why would this purple even be on the map? Renewable grid mixed power. Because the utility has renewable energy that is not REC'd. So hydropower is renewable energy. If your utility tells you 7% of my grid mix is hydro, well, you can peanut butter that across everybody because you can't buy a REC for hydro. So 7% of the energy I am buying from the utility is renewable. Hydro is now renewable. Wasn't it is now. I can account for that and peanut butter it because nobody else is buying the rights to, so I can account for that. However, let's take nuclear. Nuclear is not a renewable energy. It is a carbon-free energy source. I can account for that too there. So, I mean, if I'm not so focused on renewable energy, but actually focused on reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas, carbon-free energy, nuclear is carbon-free energy. If my utility is 20% nuclear, there's no REC for nuclear, I can count 20% of whatever I'm drawing from the utility, because it's nuclear, as carbon-free in my purple area here. So to your point, sir, you're talking about matching and everything. Thank God for the utilities, because like when I go to a solar provider to buy 80,000 gigawatt hours, they've got to produce about 200 gigawatt hours because it's only on during the day and it's not on at night. If we had storage, it wouldn't matter because you're storing that excess and releasing it. But to your point, it isn't somebody else is using that excess power, and I'm just taking credit for it at night when I'm using technically brown power because there's no solar power. So people who talk about time matching of power, that's what they're talking about. But quite honestly, in the end, reduction and elimination of greenhouse gases. I have bought 80,000, I don't care who's using it, I have eliminated greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere regardless of who's using it, when or whatever. But we're going to get to the point where that's going to become more critical and people are going to start paying more attention to it. And because people pay more attention to it, well, we're going to have to measure it and account for it. So it's hard to do right now, sir. It's a great point. There's a lot of stuff out there about it, but it's hard. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Is all construction
all construction considered scope 3? In my mind, my definition of construction, I think so, because it's one time. You know, it's greenhouse gas emissions associated with delivering a thing to me. And once it's delivered to me and construction stops, there's no more greenhouse gas other than my operating it. I would think so, but you seem to be going somewhere with that.
I was just curious, I mean, capital projects, right? You're always building new stuff, you're always doing new things to the site.
And that was when I had the graph up there accounting for capital replacements, you know, of the equipment in there. You would eventually even take into account fixing a roof, putting a new roof on. All of those things have some kind of greenhouse gas emission associated with them we should be accounting for. Mostly for the purpose of, because we're watching and we're accounting for it, we're encouraging the person doing the work or providing the product to do less of, to incorporate less carbon into it because we're holding them accountable for it, just like we're being held accountable. So I would say yes. Yeah. You know, it's an interesting discussion because I bet we brainstorm, we can think of some things. Well, that doesn't really count. I don't know that that would count. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Beautiful.
Europe is already asking now people to report on scope 3, and I would advise everybody to download electricity maps as an app. It's an app you get free. It's non-for-profit, reports real-time energy mix of a lot of the world's energy. It's really interesting to watch because that should actually shape where you place data centers. According to McKinsey, 7% only is latency sensitive and needs to be in cities that are being operated a lot of large loads. And the rest of it can start migrating. So I think the real problem here is that the customers that we're solving for are not really, splitting the loads and making sure that what needs to be in cities are in cities and what can travel to places where you have a different energy mix actually can do so.
So site selection, absolutely. And there's a lot of discussion out there, and that's right around the construction piece there about choosing selecting your sites would be, well, result in less carbon emissions, less greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So great point. I mean, in the past, site selection was always about, can you get power, can you get network? You know, you said you cite a McKinsey study that's saying only 7% are really that network sensitive or so. I haven't seen it, so I can't speak to it, but yeah, there's plenty of areas we can go that have lots. I mean, look at the Northwest. I mean, that's mostly hydro up there, which is why it's so cheap, why there's so many data centers up there. Yeah, so what was, can you share that website again, or? Just look up electricity maps? All right. Yeah. Right. Neat. Very cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's fun stuff to look at. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes, sir.
There was a lot of talk yesterday at the Build conference about transmission line building and reducing your energy load to the grid by reducing the percentage of your energy on transmission lines. How is that reported? Is that calculated in what people are considering? Or is only accurate what the
Right, right. Yeah, that's all on the construction side. Again, for most of us, data center managers, we don't even look at that sort of thing. I mean, I've read a lot of great papers, especially on EV cars and how, charging at night, the transformers don't get to cool when they were designed to be able to cool and all that kind of stuff. It's just fascinating. And you just take a look at our grid and how old it is and how, you talk about just opportunity for upgrade and improvement. And then, of course, running new transmission, not just distribution, but just, transmission lines. It's a nightmare. It's just horrible. We're electrifying it in an enormous way, but the underlying foundation of our generation and our distribution, or transmission to distribution, just isn't keeping up. And they're kind of stodgy anyways. They're slow to move anyways. So they're not for profit or anything. So it could be a train wreck. Yeah. So I don't know a lot about that, sir. So I don't know if there was really a question there or not. But it's not anything we pay a lot of attention to. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, the efficiency and the losses. Oh my God, I mean, I've seen numbers, but I don't know how real they are. But they're scary. It's not good. I mean, it certainly speaks a lot to a microgrid. Just generate it closer so you don't have those losses. Anybody else? Yes. I tell you, it's extremely, again, the question is water. How important is water? Holy cow. That's one thing that isn't necessarily regulated, but you won't get a permit in a lot of cities or towns that you're trying to build in if you're water-based. Now, unfortunately, you don't have to use water. None of our data centers use water. We're air-cooled everything, so we're kind of friendly in that regard. When we put in our permit, we aren't looking to draw a lot of power from the municipality, but a lot of people still are, and they don't get their permits. I mean, even if they're zoned and they've had some promises or handshakes, when it comes time to actually deliver it, the municipality just can't deliver that kind of water to them, so they look at wells and gray water and lots of other things. But it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and quite honestly, you can build a data center, and a lot of us are, that don't use water. You take it used to take a fairly large energy efficiency hit, not so much anymore. I mean, with economization and everything, you can do just fine. So I think that there's got to be some rethinking around that. But quite honestly, the permit process and where you want to build is going to drive that. And it is driving it right now, absolutely. There's big deal down in Arizona. I could go on and on, but that's a big deal, so it's a good point. Yeah. Anybody else? You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you very much. Certainly enjoyed your company today.